One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7. Not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear. Not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody, and then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silveira, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silveira, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the cartel sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's going to be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the cartel sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder, he got out, and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster, Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, like, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she'd already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry. And then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. Based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here, but he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house. And so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult, they called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down and they brought him in for an interview. And boy oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car, and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery, and then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither men have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg. At which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him, and so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the trigger man, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime. The next story of today's episode is called The Bear, the Plane, and the Duffel. In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's going to do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence. On the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky, that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing. And come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around. And then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing. And when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it. And with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, 2 pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the 2 pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the 2 pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, "Hey, why are you following me? What's going on?" Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, "I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both going to have to jump out of this plane." Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction going at a constant speed at a constant altitude until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the 2 of them, they climb back over the 2 front seats, they go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the 2 pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute. And then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway,
And on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy, or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground, basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy, and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the 2 pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell. So the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag, all of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once, and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home, and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Myers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton, who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, but after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just going to fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags. However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what? That duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty. Because, as we already know, that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear's story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, "Cocaine Bear."